I suppose one of the things that's very synonymous with Limerick is its love of rugby and its development of rugby. And for some people, I suppose rugby goes back as far as 1978 and the Great All Blacks match, and for some it goes back far further than that. But it's unusual, and Limerick, where rugby is played by the docker and the doctor, as they say, and it pretty much goes across all social bounds. That rugby became established in Limerick at all, I suppose, is a strange story, isn't it?
It is. I suppose perhaps the most eminent scholar of the history of rugby in Limerick would be Tom Hayes, who's written a lot about that. And of course, another major scholar of Limerick's rugby history would be Charlie Mulqueen. But Tom Hayes tells us that, contrary to what is often thought, he maintains that rugby was not introduced to Limerick by the British garrison. It was introduced by some of the local middle-class boys, young men, who brought rugby back with them from England and introduced it to Limerick. If you think that rugby only began around 1871, the Rugby Football Union was established in England. There was a sort of a schism when rugby broke away from soccer. The FA, Football Association, had been established in 1863 in England. Rugby broke away in 1871 and formed its own association. In Ireland, then, you had a couple of rugby organisations, one in Belfast and the other for the rest of the country. They joined together in 1879 to form the IRFU. So Limerick was very quick off the mark, because it is thought that the earliest rugby club in Limerick, that earliest known one, was in Rathkeale. It's mentioned in 1874, and again Tom Hayes has written very extensively about this. But Tom would say that the real founder of Limerick rugby was William Lamb Stokes, and he gives him credit for bringing rugby from being very embryonic to becoming very well established. So, for example, Lamb Stokes was very much involved in the first Limerick Rugby Club, or Limerick City Rugby Club rather, which was the County Limerick Club, which was founded in 1876 and flourished into the early 1880s. And Lamb Stokes then was subsequently involved as well in the establishment of the Garryowen Rugby Club in 1884. And really from that time onwards that rugby began to take off and began to bed down and began to spread out, because then of course other clubs such as Shannon was also founded in 1884. And then obviously when more than one club, when you have a galaxy of clubs then in any particular sport, in any particular region, well then you have a sufficiently wide network then to create I suppose a more durable organisation. And Hayes refers very strongly to the importance of the rugby administrator. And this is where Lamb Stokes was very, very significant, because he was a very significant and a very competent administrator. And of course, then he also was involved in the IRFU as well.
Indeed, and I suppose Charles Barrington as well of Glenstall. Barrington would have been very much part of that grouping as well.
Correct. Very much so. And actually Sir Alexander Shaw as well was another of them.
Indeed. I suppose to take it that step further, then Lamb Stokes would have come to Limerick from around Tralee originally, wasn't it?
Correct. He established himself in Limerick as a butter merchant, and that very much cemented his connections with both rural and urban Limerick, because he was living in Limerick City, but because he was a butter merchant, he had strong connections with the rural community in Limerick. And he was one of these people who was involved in literally everything that was going on. He sat, for example, on Limerick City Council from 1899 until his death in 1910. He was a Protestant Home Ruler. He also was very much involved in his own Church of Ireland, Select Vestry and so on. And he was also involved in the Limerick Protestant Young Men's Association. He was involved in cycling. He was involved in the Freemasons. There was nothing that was going on in Limerick that Lamb Stokes was not involved with. And even if we allow that the obituaries were rather flowery in the Victorian and Edwardian times, we can still see that when he died in 1910, he was very well regarded, because all of the newspapers, both the Limerick Leader, which would have been nationalist, Limerick Chronicle, which was that stage regarded as being unionist, and other newspapers, all reported him reported his death with great regret, and they all expressed how much popularity and how much his influence in Limerick had been over the previous number of decades.
In looking at the history, and this is where I suppose it ties into where I sit literally today in the Markets Field. Looking at that, the first recorded usage for a sports purpose of the Markets Field actually was through the Irish Cycling Association, believe it or not, and that was back in the early 1880s. I would imagine that from what you've said, Lamb Stokes was probably involved in that.
Oh, he was, in the cycling, definitely, yes. I'm not too sure about his involvement now with the Markets Field, but I dare say he was, because he was very much involved with the Chamber of Commerce and the Limerick Market Trustees. So therefore, I would be almost 100% certain that he was involved with the with the Markets Fields. And of course, as you rightly say, I mean, it predates both Thomond Park, which was established in 1926, and the Gaelic Grounds, which was established in 1932 by several decades. So, I mean, the Market Fields would definitely be by far the oldest sports venue in Limerick.
And whatever about being involved, I suppose, with the Cycling Association, certainly by 1886 we see Garryowen Rugby Club being formed, and of course Garryowen Rugby Club was operated out of the Markets Field at that point.
Was it? That's very interesting, actually, because I mean, obviously the Market Field was a sort of a multi-purpose venue at that stage, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Well, it would have been owned by the Market Trustees, and there's a very interesting story as to how it came into sports usage. It was originally designed, believe it or not, for housing, and there had been a major outcry as to the fact that it should be allowed for sports usage, and from there it developed into a sports ground in the about the mid 1880s, and Garryowen Rugby Club, of course, formed from here. But Lamb Stokes then, of course, was intimately involved in the whole setting up of Garryowen Rugby Club, wouldn't he have been?
He was, yes. And interestingly, Lamb Stokes, this is another point that Tom Hayes and others have made about him, is that he was very much an ecumenical figure, because you must remember that in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, in both Limerick and nationally, there was a great deal of sectarian division, but Lamb Stokes crossed that sectarian division in that he was involved with major Catholic nationalist figures such as Michael Joyce, later MP for Limerick from 1900 to 1918. Now, Lamb Stokes himself, as I say, was a Protestant home ruler. He was a Protestant nationalist. But there was, it seems at the time, a certain amount of crossover between the various religious and political groupings, and that they were able to come together in the venue of sports, which I suppose was perhaps a happy contrast to the situation, for example, in some place like Belfast, or indeed in Glasgow, and indeed in Liverpool as well, where the soccer was very much polarised around religious divisions. If you look at, obviously Celtic was Catholic and Rangers were Protestant, but you had a similar division in Liverpool, where Everton was traditionally regarded as being Catholic, and Liverpool was regarded as being Protestant. And of course, Belfast had a similar situation with Linfield and the various Catholic clubs. So I wouldn't like to, because I think the research hasn't been done yet, I wouldn't like to suggest that Limerick was a sort of a multi-religious and a multi-ethnic paradise as regards sport. But there seems to be, and certainly Lamb Stokes and some of his colleagues were very ecumenical in both their involvement in several sports and in their involvement with people of different religious persuasions.
Would you have any view on, obviously when rugby set up here in Limerick, it set up right around the country, but why did it take in Limerick more than it took in other parts of the country, or would you have a view on that?
There have been a number of theories put forward, and again Tom Hayes would be one of those, and again Charlie Mulqueen, because in many respects I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were, in my studies of these matters and my research into these matters. But I suppose initially rugby would have been very much a middle class sport, and it remains so, of course, throughout the rest of Ireland, more or less to the present. And of course, to broaden out organised sports in the 19th century were very much a middle class phenomenon, and that's also true of Gaelic games, because who else but the upper classes and the middle classes would have had sufficient leisure time, sufficient resources, to actually become actively engaged in sport. I think one of the theories that has been put forward is that whereas in Belfast, in Belfast, in Dublin, in Cork, there was quite a large middle class, which would have been able to support enough rugby clubs to create a healthy competition. That in Limerick, the middle class was comparatively small, as the city was smaller, obviously, than the other three I mentioned, and therefore it was necessary to go outside the sort of the original middle class pool in search of other players and other supporters, and in that manner it is speculated that Limerick rugby became much more democratised than it did in other parts of Ireland. Another theory then, which of course would be putting Limerick rugby in the context of New Zealand and Wales and parts of Australia and so on, would be that it became a mass sport because there was a kind of a culture of manliness, that there was a lot of strong men engaged in a lot of manual labour, such as in the docks and in the various other factories in Limerick, and that would then have created an outlet for rugby, because this was a way where they could express their manhood in, I suppose, an organised and in a legitimate fashion. Because when you think about it, I mean, people have always been playing football. You had the notorious Coid, for example, which was a very unruly form of Gaelic football. It was played for centuries in Ireland, and it was really played by rival mobs from different parishes who literally just had at each other, and often fatalities resulted. And then when the GAA came along, of course, they put a stop to that. They reduced the unruliness. They drew up proper rules and regulations. And I think the same was true of rugby, that, I suppose, maybe aggression that men would have displayed, not only in Limerick but nationwide and indeed worldwide, was then channeled into much more organised and much more civilised channels. And I think you see that in Wales, where rugby became the national sport. It happened in New Zealand. It didn't happen in, for example, England, which is the cradle of rugby. It's very much a niche sport there as well, compared to what it would be in Wales and in New Zealand. So you could kind of back Limerick, Wales, New Zealand as being three parts of the world where rugby became a mass sport,
We'll go back to Lamb Stokes, William Lamb Stokes, a fascinating character, and I've been reading a fair bit about him, I suppose, over the last while. As you said, accepted across the ecumenical divide very much at a time when people weren't, but also linked to some of the other major characters in Limerick of the time, the likes of Alexander Shaw, of course, of Shaw's Bacon Factory, Charles Barrington, and others who were very much in the merchant classes of Limerick.
And also, of course, he would also have been linked with Michael Joyce, who was a very interesting character as well, MP for Limerick from 1900 to 1918. And Joyce would, of course, have described himself as being the first working class MP for Limerick. Now, he was a river pilot by profession. We can argue about whether a river pilot would have been considered working class or not, but certainly compared to the MPs who had preceded him, who were all very, very either upper middle class or in earlier years would have been gentry. He would definitely have been much more proletarian than they were. But again, I think you can see how Lamb Stokes, who was he was a butter merchant, so he would have definitely, I suppose, been higher up the social divide of the period than Joyce. But you can see how they actually were able to work together quite successfully in building up Garryowen Rugby Club. And again, I suppose those sort of personal connections were very important in establishing the whole infrastructure of sport in Limerick. And oftentimes that it was actually very important figures like Lamb Stokes who were involved in several clubs, and we can even see this nowadays, how many clubs are synonymous, aren't they, with a charismatic chairman or secretary who's held the post maybe for 10, 20, 30 years, and in some extreme instances, indeed, when somebody was no longer involved in the club, it actually folded. And I think there may be some suggestion that the role of Lamb Stokes in he was involved in both the county Limerick Rugby Club, and then he moved to Garryowen, and it perhaps may have been due to that the county Limerick Rugby Club then folded after a few years.
It's interesting, of course, as well, that a lot of the lands that would have been owned by the Protestant Young Men's Association, and I'm thinking the LPYMA out around the Lansdowne area,
Yes.
would have been intimately involved with rugby in the early stages. Indeed, I think there was a rugby international played there way back in the early 1890s. But that the fulcrum seems to have shifted then to the Markets Field when that came into play, and I wonder how much of that would have had to do with the geographic location of the Markets Field being so close to Shaw's Bacon Factory, obviously, in Mulgar Street, but also the cooperative milk society where Lamb Stokes would have been held sway for 37 years, I think it was, by the time he retired.
Yes, I would say very possibly, because if you go back to I suppose, to broaden out the discussion briefly for a minute or two, organised sports are a feature of the second half of the 19th century. As I mentioned earlier, there were always people kicking balls, or indeed maybe more often kicking their fellow players, for right down through the centuries. And extreme examples, for example, in Central America, you had a ball game which resulted, it is thought, in the execution of the losing team. Happily, we've moved on a bit from that. But in the late 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, organised sports developed. As I mentioned already, the Football Association established in England in 1863. That's the beginning of soccer. 1871, the Rugby Union established in England, beginning of rugby. Here in Ireland, 1884, the GA, beginning of Gaelic games, as we know them. And part of that was the Industrial Revolution created, I suppose, the conditions for organised sports in a number of ways. First of all, you had urbanisation, and if you look here in Limerick, even in Ireland, which wasn't a particularly urbanised country by the standards of Western Europe, organised sports really took off, began in the big cities and towns. Even the GA, which prides itself quite rightly as being a rural organisation, or at least an organisation with a very broad sweep throughout the country, but it really got started in the cities and in the towns. And urbanisation was very important because you brought large numbers of people together. You had the pool of players, of administrators, and of course of spectators. And also because of industrialisation, of urbanisation, people were cut off then from the field. So these other earlier versions of sport that we refer to were not. You couldn't have one of these massive sort of games of football come riots around cities anymore. And then the other thing, of course, was that industrialisation then also created leisure time for the first time. If you think about it, that sports and pastimes, they really only evolved along with free time. And the Industrial Revolution, we often regarded as being a very, I suppose, harsh and a very brutal process. It was, of course, that. But in the long run, it established the concept of people working fixed hours. Then you had fixed time off, and then of course the weekend evolved, and then there had to be some means found to fill this extra time, and of course organised sports filled the void very well. And what happened then was, of course, they percolated down then from the upper class, the middle classes, down to all sectors of society. And then of course mass communications then were also majorly important, because with the development of print media, with the development of radio, telegraph, later on, of course, television. I mean, then the sports revolution really took off then, So, I mean, again, I think, going back to your point about the Markets Field versus the LYPMA, I mean, the Market Field was much more centrally located. And at the time when this particular transition would have taken place, you still didn't have, now the railways were there, of course, right? But, I mean, bicycles would have been very important, by the way. The humble bicycle would have played a very important role in the dissemination of sports, because we often forget how important the bicycle was as a mode of transport, and the revolutionary aspects it had on social life. But I think the Market Field, as you say, it occupied a very pivotal position in the centre of the city. Most people in the late 19th and well into the 20th century lived in the city centre. The suburbs were only really getting started. So most people who attended matches of any description, they would walk to them. And it's much easier to walk to the Market Fields if you're living around the city centre than it is to walk out over the Sarsfield Bridge and out to the Ennis Road. So I think literally it was location, really, in the most practical sense,
Matt, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. We might pick it up again and perhaps look at the GA on another occasion and see where that goes. But thanks so much. It's been a fascinating chat. Thank you.
Colin, thank you very much then.